Hello and welcome to the third webinar of the Seabed Habitats Seminar Series. This is a monthly series of talks held on the last Tuesday of every month. I'm your host, Siddhi Joshi, and I'd like to welcome all of you for attending from many different time zones. The third Seabed Habitats Seminar is by Dr. Huw Griffiths of the British Antarctic Survey. Huw is a marine biogeographer with an interest in polar regions, and Huw is a passionate believer in science communication and making science more accessible to the public, policymakers, and government. In 2020, Dr. Huw Griffiths was awarded the SCAR Medal for Education and Communication. And I first met you in 2019 when I visited the British Antarctic Survey offices in Cambridge. And Huw is a founding member of Pride in Polar Research Network and has recently been involved in an exciting discovery with, in the southeastern Weddell Sea. So I'll hand it over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll just start sharing my screen because I'm not the best at multitasking, so I'll make sure I get that right before I start talking. There we go. Share. So hopefully now you can all see a picture of Antarctica under the sea. So I'm going to get to the seabed part soon, I promise. But a lot of people don't really know anything about Antarctica. So for me, it's kind of important that we cover what is Antarctica before we get on to why the bits I study are particularly special to me. So this is underwater, but from space, this is what Antarctica looks like. That's South Africa at the top of the picture. So hopefully you can see my, sorry, I'll go back. At the top of the picture, you can see my mouse moving. That's South Africa. This is the continent of Antarctica, and around it is sea ice. Now, although I'm going to be talking about the bottom of the sea, everything in Antarctica is linked, and especially to that ice. And that ice actually doubles the area of the continent during winter time and then shrinks back in summer, which we can see in this video here. So this is a year when we had the record low for Antarctic sea ice. So this is 2016 into 2017. So we're just coming to spring in September, October times, because it's the Southern Hemisphere, obviously that's summertime, coming into November. And you can see that the ice around Antarctica is slowly melting away. And this has a huge effect on the life beneath. So whereas this ice melts, there's a lot of phytoplankton in the ice, but it also allows for huge phytoplankton blooms to happen. And you end up with the ice shrinking away. And in those areas that are exposed, a huge amount of productivity. So there's 24-hour daylight and a lot of food being produced. And that means there's a lot of food getting into the ecosystem. And that is an enormous abundance of life, which really sharply contrasts with the life on land. So if you look at this map of Antarctica taken up from lots of satellite images, Antarctica is our typical image of Antarctica is ice and snow. And that's not surprising because only about 0.4% of the surface of the continent is free of ice and snow. So it's bare rock or gravel. And in parts, this ice is over 4 kilometers thick. So it's so heavy that the whole continent is being pushed down by up to 1 kilometer in places into the earth by the weight of the ice, which means it's the highest, driest, coldest, windiest desert in the world because there's no liquid water, there's no free-flowing rivers, there's occasional lakes, but those are only in the extreme north parts of it, and some subglacial lakes. But essentially you're talking about a very dry, cold, barren place. And the biggest plants are mosses, lichens, and liverworts. And you occasionally get tussock grasses further north, which are very hardy grasses. And that's it. That's kind of, and if you think about the area they've got to live in, it's only very tiny. And the largest land animals, because we don't count penguins or seals or albatrosses and things as land animals, are springtails, mites, tardigrades, so all really tiny but really hardy, and some wingless insects really are the biggest animals we have on land. And it's quite crazy, but these animals survive in the most extreme conditions, and they can be frozen solid and thawed out and then just go about their business. So they're really hardy, but it's not a very complicated food web. It's not a very exciting place to look if you're looking for biodiversity, because it's special, but there's not that much of it. Whereas life in the sea is the opposite. Antarctica is home to the largest animal that's ever lived. The blue whale goes there to feed in summer. We also have resident populations of all the other cutesy things that people imagine from Antarctica: seals, penguins, whales, etc. Now, this ocean is special because of that 24-hour daylight, but also because it's very isolated. So if we look at the top left-hand corner, you can see the world, and you can see the wind patterns for the world. And yellow means fast, strong winds. And as you can see, in what's called the roaring 40s, the furious 50s, and the screaming 60s in the south, we have no land to block this wind's progression around the world. So it gets faster and faster. And that then drives the ocean currents around this sort of between 40 something and 60 degrees south. And it drives the world's fastest and strongest ocean currents, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which isolates Antarctica. It keeps warm water out and keeps cold water in, and is one of the reasons why Antarctica is frozen in the first place. Now, this is two maps. The one on the left is ocean surface temperature, between plus 20 in red down to -3 in dark blue. And the same color scheme on the map on the right is sea floor temperatures. That means if you live in the surface of the ocean, or your larvae are traveling around in the surface waters, you're very restricted about getting in and out of Antarctica. You're really dependent on freak weather events or gyres and things to get you across that front. Whereas if you live in the very deep sea, you can travel as far as Rio de Janeiro in Antarctic temperature waters in the deep sea. So there's a huge difference between the connectivity of the seafloor and that of the surface waters and plankton. But if you do live on the seafloor, this water is incredibly deep. So if you look at this map of bathymetry, to get between places and Antarctica, you have to cross an average of 3,000 meter deep water to get anywhere. So Antarctica is very geographically isolated. It's also temperature isolated, and also isolated by these huge currents and winds. So that means that over 50% of the species we find on the seafloor in Antarctica are unique to Antarctica and found nowhere else. Now, this is a handy diagram produced by one of our colleagues, who showed the kind of different levels of life in Antarctica from the sea surface right through to the seafloor. Now, it doesn't quite tell the whole story because the biodiversity isn't in there. So we have an estimated 20,000 plus species in Antarctica in the oceans. And that, it ranges from your whales through to tiny invertebrates, but also doesn't include things like viruses or bacteria and things. They're not included in that total. And of this 20,000 odd species, only about 90 of them are your classic Antarctic animals that you think of instantly when you think South Pole. So the penguins, the seals, and this is a huge male elephant seal, whales, and albatrosses, for example. So the bird seals, furry, fluffy things, and even some large predatory fish come into that kind of 90-ish species. So as you go further down the water column, you really have a real difficulty kind of understanding how much the biodiversity increases from that flat white desert at the surface. So we have around 700 species in the plankton and mesopelagic fish and things like that. So these are more numerous than the top predators, as you'd expect in terms of species numbers. But actually, there's one species within that which is really dominant, which is Antarctic krill, Euphorsia superba. And this plays a huge role in the Antarctic ecosystem. So it eats phytoplankton that are the base of the food chain. So they're up in the surface waters, you have these tiny microscopic plants which are eaten directly by the krill. And in this food web of Antarctica, then surprisingly, it's one step through krill straight into your top predators. So you'll have even the blue whales, you'll have penguins, you'll have seals, you'll have all sorts of predators directly eating the first consumer in the food chain. And although that's all going on at the surface, these krill play a huge role in what happens next, because the phytoplankton is at the surface, the water's quite stratified, especially in summer, so it's very difficult for that food to reach the sea floor. But krill eat the phytoplankton. They're quite messy eaters, so they'll drop what are called spitballs or whatever, so they'll have mashed up some food, but then drop it by mistake, and that will start to rain down. But also their excrement or poop sinks much faster than individual cells of phytoplankton because it's all compacted together. And this rains down on the seafloor, especially in summer, providing a huge amount of food. So that food then supports the entire seafloor ecosystem. And life at the bottom of the sea is incredibly rich compared to that white, shiny, icy desert at the surface. And it represents 90-something% of all the species we know from Antarctica, and these cover most major phyla of organisms. And you would be forgiven looking at this image for thinking there's black corals here, there's soft corals, there's crinoids, there's brittle stars. Firstly, there's huge sponges. You'd be forgiven firstly for thinking this was a tropical reef of some sort. But also when you look at it again, you're lacking the crushing predators or the sharks or the rays or lobsters or crabs. So if you're a paleontologist, this looks more like a reconstruction of the time when the dinosaurs were around than it does a modern day marine benthic habitat elsewhere in the world. So it's really interesting that because of this 24-hour daylight and the extreme cold with water of about -2 degrees centigrade, these animals are dominating. These kind of filter feeders and detritivores really do dominate this habitat. And predatory animals are just less common. And they're also come as a surprise. So you get some predatory brittle stars, for example, that will grab krill out of the water column, or some that will even catch fish. Here's another beautiful image, and you can see a huge yellow sponge at the base here, but also yellow crinoids, different types of corals, and a huge abundance as well as diversity. And as I promised, the fish, and actually the fish in Antarctica are really interesting because they're relatively limited in diversity at the higher end of diversity. So there are very few families that can cope really well with this extreme cold. But some of the fish are even sacrificed their red blood cells because they don't need them because of the huge amount of oxygen in the seawater to be able to produce antifreeze proteins in their blood instead so that they don't freeze up and they can move around even in the coldest temperatures. And this very cold water that supports all this oxygen also allows some animals to get absolutely enormous. And I'll show you some large ones later on. But basically polar gigantism is allowed to happen because of this cold water. And also this food raining down from above isn't just limited to this dead phytoplankton. We also get things like whale falls and other things, including a rarely seen penguin fall, where you can see a poor little Adelie penguin, which is now being reduced to just a rib cage and bones with its flippers left on, being eaten by sea urchins, brittle stars and starfish. And down here, you can see a fish as well. But actually one of the huge things that will eat these kind of things will be either Nemertean worms, which could be 1 or 2 meters long in Antarctica, and they will predate on any kind of dead or decaying matter, starfish, which are quite aggressive predators there, but also amphipods and other small crustaceans, which are almost like swarms of piranha or whatever. They'll strip a carcass bare very quickly. So although life is very slow in the cold, when they find food, they'll jump on it. Not all of it, though, is dominated by these corals and sponges and the classic Antarctic environment. There are huge areas which are covered in what's called diatomaceous ooze, or just mud that's made up from diatom-rich sediments. And on these massive plains of mud, you see a slightly different fauna. So in this one, we have a type of sea snail called Harpovoluta, which is the white element of this. Then on its shell and completely covering its shell is a sea anemone. And these sea anemones get benefits of being moved around to where there's suitable food. And the snail gets the protection of the stinging cells of the anemone. And you almost always find that snail with one of those anemones living on. So we have no idea at what point in their life cycle they get together. You can also see a brittle star here at the surface. And these are actually all over the place in here. Wherever you can see little bits sticking out that look like small bits of corals or hydroids, they're probably the ends of limbs of brittle stars. And when you look closer, you see more of them in the images. And this blob here is actually a benthic siphonophore. So a bit like a Portuguese man of war, but they attach themselves with their threads to the seafloor and are like a slightly floating fishing net above the seafloor. And here's another patch of seafloor with a kind of mixed substrate. So you've got a few bryozoans and hydroids and things growing on any rocks and anything that's there. But you also have more of these brittle stars, a lot of brittle stars. Echinoderms are really big in Antarctica. And speaking of big, there's a huge starfish here, and that would be somewhere in the region of 0.5 meter across. And then we have lots of sponges and other things as well, encrusting on any little pebbles and rocks that appear. Here are some sea anemones, and again, these are really big, and some sea anemones get to 1 meter long in Antarctica. And we have these yellowy orange ones down here. We also have a pink coloured one here, and don't be fooled, the two bits underneath it are actually a pair of sea cucumbers. And just below that is an Antarctic sea spider just clinging to the edge of the rock. So there's a lot of diversity even in these barren looking muddy plains. And as we move into the shallows, there's even more life. But this life is under threat from iceberg scour. So icebergs move around and scrape the shallow regions. And if they're very shallow life, there's also a lot of ice scour from sea ice in the winter. But the amount of sea ice can also reduce the amount of macroalgae, so seaweeds that can grow. So it gives them a chance to dominate. So you'll have animal-dominated habitats rather than macroalgae-dominated habitats in the shallows. And as you can see here, we have a whole bunch of starfish and what are called sea lemons, which are a type of gastropod mollusk, so snails, that have their shell internally in this case. And also there's a little fish sticking out in the corner here as well. And these are very common species you'll see in the shallow waters around Antarctica. What you may not be used to seeing would be brachiopods. So brachiopods look like clams or bivalves, but these are a much older group than the mollusks and the bivalves. And they've been around for millions and millions of years. And these ones have got a coating here of bryozoans, and there's a small shrimp here. And then these other organisms here are back again to echinoderms, so more sea cucumbers and starfish, and even a sea urchin creeping into the top of this picture. And there's also more bryozoans down here. But there is a real bivalve in there as well somewhere. So we also get these amazing areas where icebergs can't hit them. So this is a cliff wall underwater in Antarctica. And you can see huge, enormous sponges growing on the side. So the diver is quite useful for scale. And there's also massive soft corals, ascidians, all sorts of other things growing really big. And some Antarctic sponges have been dated to live for over 10,000 years. So there's a huge ability for these animals to live a very long time as well. This is one of the fish I was telling you about that actually is able to, it has clear blood, no red blood cells, but is also able to produce glycerol and other chemicals to keep itself free of ice, stop its blood freezing up. And these animals are quite amazing because Antarctica hasn't always been icy. So they've evolved to a changing world and now a really unique part of the Antarctic ecosystem. And speaking of unique, this is an Antarctic sea spider. And you get sea spiders all over the world. In most areas, they're probably the size of your thumbnail or little fingernail, and you wouldn't even notice them on the beach. In Antarctica, they get to the size of a dinner plate. And many of them even have extra legs. So instead of just 8 pairs of walking legs, they have far more, up to 12 walking legs. And behind it, you can see some limpets on the rocks, so something far more familiar to most people. And these limpets are amazing because they can live even in the areas which get frozen up on the very intertidal areas. And now I'm going to whiz through a few slides just to show you biodiversity in different groups of Antarctic organisms. So we have worms here. We have everything from burrowing worms through to ones that scamper around on the surface of the mud looking for food. And some of these can get to about the length of a human arm. We have mollusks. We have all sorts of mollusks. We have octopus, we have nudibranchs, we have gastropods, we have bivalves, we have chitons. So there's a whole range of mollusks in Antarctica. This is the diversity within one group of isopod crustaceans. So within one family, the Cerolidae, and they look very similar to trilobites, but they're a completely different lineage. But one of the species is even called Trilobitoides because it resembles a trilobite so much. And this is another type of isopod. This is Glyptonotus antarcticus, and that would be bigger than a human hand. It's a large isopod, and it is a detritivore, so it'll scuttle around on the seafloor, mopping up all the dead and decaying bits from everything else. These are amphipod crustaceans. So if you imagine the sandhoppers on the beach, if you turn over a piece of seaweed, or some people call them sand fleas, and they'll bounce around. These are the marine cousins of those. And as you can see, there's a huge amount of not only color diversity, but body shape, and they all do different things within the water column. So these are, though, the things that can strip the flesh off a dead or decaying animal very quickly, because they can sniff out the food, and almost within an hour or so of putting some baited traps down, you will get hundreds and hundreds of amphipods. And most people are surprised by corals and cnidarians in Antarctica, because we don't have the corals like you have in a coral reef that have photosynthetic symbionts, so small algae that live in their bodies. These don't have those, but they do catch prey in the same way that other corals do, with tiny tentacles that they have and stinging cells. And they're very similar to the cold water corals elsewhere in the world, but we have them from the shallows right through to the very deep sea in Antarctica. And getting on to more echinoderms, so the sea cucumbers definitely play a huge role in Antarctica, and that big pink stripy one, pinky purpley stripy one in the middle is called Brachiopods, and it's huge. It can get up to about, well, over 1/2 meter long, and it's pretty solid and plasticky feeling. It's a real beast of an animal. And beneath it is a type of sea pig that we get in Antarctica as well. The sea pigs are amazing because they wander around on these little sort of modified tube hydrostatic feet, and they sort of gobble up the sediments with their mouth at this end. The more echinoderms, we have brittle stars and basket stars, and the diversity within these in Antarctica is huge, and they're also a good way of testing with genetics how the relationships between different regions of Antarctica are connected through oceanography and things. Starfish. Starfish are everywhere in the world, but not many places have a 50-armed starfish which can grab fish or krill out of the water column. So Antarctica does have an amazing array of starfish, but also they live a lot of different life modes. And then back to, as I say, some of my favorites, these giant sea spiders. And you can see they come in a range of shapes, colors, and different numbers of legs. And they really are quite a mystery. The biggest species, Colossendeus megalonyx, nobody's ever seen them reproducing or with eggs or young. But most of the other species, It's believed that the females lay the eggs, but then she hands them over to the male, who has a special set of limbs for carrying the eggs, and then he will carry the eggs and young until they're ready to make their own way. So it's a very different way of living. They are mostly leg, so their guts actually spread down into their legs, and they breathe through tiny holes in their skeleton, so most of their breathing is done through their legs as well. So they're quite an amazing group of animals. So even if you don't like spiders, the fact that the males do all the parenting and they can breathe through their legs, you've got to respect them for a little bit of being a bit special and amazing looking as well. And now I'm going to show you a video of the seafloor in Antarctica, and I hope it plays well for you where you are and isn't too grainy. So these are some of those giant sponges I was talking about with feather stars and starfish and things sitting on them. There's a close-up of some of the corals, and you can see colour in it. This is a sea squirt with a small isopod sat on top of it. We also have a fish living inside a sponge, and this is possibly the first time this fish has ever seen daylight, but it's taking advantage of it to catch the krill. And there will be bioluminescence down there as well. There's a large octopus, and here's one of those ice fish with the antifreeze for blood just getting in on the video shot. And then we have the more giant sponges with giant brittle stars of the curly things off the top, and also other organisms growing on them. So once you have a sponge, it becomes a home to a lot of other things. And here are some of those crinoids or feather stars actually swimming. Now, if they're disturbed, they will swim and try to get to somewhere else. And just finishing up now on a sponge and soft coral bed. And that last thing you saw was a giant sea anemone. So that is the life that is under most of the Antarctic sea ice area. So that area I showed you in the beginning where it freezes over in winter. But there are also parts of the Antarctic continent that are shown in this diagram that are under ice shelves. So glaciers on land push forwards into the sea. And this pushes the ice forwards until it starts to float. And that becomes a floating ice shelf. And these are huge. The area covered by floating ice shelves is about 1/3 of the Antarctic continental shelf, which is about 1.6 million square kilometers. And we know virtually nothing about that area under the ice shelf. So in the past, geologists and oceanographers have drilled through the ice shelf with hot water drills and lowered equipment down to see what the environment is like. And we have other areas as well when ice shelves have broken off and people have gone in there a few years later to see what was left of that environment, but never immediately after one's broken off. And as you can see in this diagram, all the food is produced outside in the sea ice zone. And then any food that is going to get to anything living in this area is being dragged under by currents. So you can see that on the outside, we see that what we've just looked at in that video, for example, where you have sponges, mollusks, echinoderms, and a lot of carbon coming down and being fixed into the environment from a lot of food at the surface. But as you go further underneath the ice shelf, the food quality and the food amount diminishes, meaning that you lose these, well, in theory, you lose these sponges and corals and things, and you end up with a few mobile predators and scavengers, and maybe even some methane seeps and other things. But basically, as further back you go, the less likely you are to find sponges and corals and things. So this is a view down one of those boreholes. And here is a comb jelly or ctenophore. We very often find amphipods and small fish that are able to swim around, and whatever food has been deposited at the back of these huge ice shelves can be found by those because they're very good, as I said, at finding food. What we never expected to find is what we did find recently. So under the Ronnie Filternet ice shelf, which is in the southeastern Weddell Sea, my colleagues at the British Antarctic Survey and some people from the Alfred Wegener Institute drilled a hole through the ice shelf to look for sediment samples. And so they drilled through 900 meters of ice and then lowered their equipment through 500 meters of seawater to get a sediment core from under the ice shelf to look at the past history of that ice shelf through the layers that build up in the mud. Now, unfortunately, they didn't hit any mud because there happened to be a boulder directly beneath where they were drilling. Fortunately for us, though, their equipment had a video camera on it. So if I show you in more detail, the site that they drilled with FSW2, which is where my mouse is hovering now. So if you imagine, these are the currents coming in. So we have water coming in from the north and going around and coming back out past that site, or water coming in from the other side on the north and coming in and going back out past that site. So although there's 260 kilometers between this site and daylight, all of the food will have had to have come at least 600 kilometers, if not 1,500 kilometers to get there. So this is the last place we expected to see any animals that couldn't scuttle around to find food or swim around to find it. And it's definitely the last place we expected to find a filter feeder, because it's essentially the end of the road in terms of food coming in horizontally from outside. So this is the video from my colleagues where they hit the rock and then the camera starts to fall down towards the rock, and you get a few glimpses of a few bits on the rock. Oh, and then it hits the floor. And then as it comes back up, we get a really lucky view of the rock. And I've edited this video so it'll explain to you what's on the rock. We're expecting to see stalked animals, sponges, and some things, and also a stalked sponge. But essentially, this is the only view we have of this type of habitat ever in the world. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of life just on that one end of the rock. And it's too much life and in too many different sizes to just be a single accidental colonization event. These things have been living there a while. So this video footage, then we were able to edit it together, get some stills, and we're able to find at least 4 types of organisms living on the rock. So these white sort of classic sponges like these. We have a stalked sponge here that looks a lot like a kind of wine glass shape. And then we have these other stalked animals, which may or may not be sponges, but we haven't got close enough up to them to see for definite what they are. Plus, within this kind of grayish stuff that was on there, when the video camera bumps into it, we also saw a kind of almost looking like a moss type looking organism, which is probably some sort of hydroid or bacterial mat or something, but we really don't know. So we have 2 organisms we think are sponges, and then who knows beyond that. But the main thing about this is that this is a whole habitat that we didn't know existed, that there were filter feeding organisms living on rocks underneath these ice shelves. And so it's a massive discovery in terms of the area, because the area covered by ice shelves in Antarctica is bigger than a country like South Africa, and we knew nothing about this entire habitat. But also, we don't know how these organisms are living there, how they're surviving on such little food, if their food is coming from the sources we think it's coming from, and also what these animals are doing for the health of the overall ecosystem and how important they are, and what will happen to them if the ice shelves collapse. So although this ice shelf is one of the most stable and biggest ones, we've already lost 2 ice shelves further north within my lifetime. So these habitats are not safe forever, especially with climate change. So on that point, I think I'm going to stop talking so that we don't go over time and there'll be chances to ask me questions and things. And I'll just finish on a picture of 2 species, one with the species name Griffithsii and one with Huw, to show that we're constantly finding new species all the time. And about 10 to 20% of what we find at normal depths is new to science in Antarctica. And about 80 or 90% of what we find in the deep sea in Antarctica is new to science. So what I want to say is that we're learning all the time. And the Antarctic seafloor is an exciting place to work, because you never quite know what you're going to find, including sponges living in a place where we don't think sponges can live. So at that point, I'll say thank you, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and hopefully you all found that interesting enough to have some questions for me.
Thank you. That's wonderful. It's brilliant to see the diversity of the organisms, I just had a question about the circumpolar current.
Yeah.
Like, is that helping? Like, how is the circumpolar current affecting the diversity? Like, is that?
It does two really important roles. So in some ways, it's a barrier. So keeping that kind of high level of endemic species. But in other ways, it helps to distribute life within the Antarctic waters. So it will move things around, because it also, as well as driving all the way around the edge, it drives local gyres and currents within there. So you'll have like the Weddell Sea gyre, where it's pushed by the water going around at the top, but then it'll drive a local gyre within that, which will help to distribute animals as well, and food. So it's the engine of Antarctica. That current is basically driving lots of things, but also helping to keep other things out. So it's a combined effect.
So we have some more questions. How often are people about to go out and sample species in Antarctica?
That's a good question. So it really depends on what science work has been funded usually. So if we have big questions about a certain area, we might put in a grant and go and do that. So I might go every 2 years or 3 years to go and do work, if you kind of average it out over my career. But there are some times when you have to go back, like back-to-back seasons or whatever, to do a bigger piece of work in one place. So there will be different people working on these things all the time. And we have people working on one of our research stations who are scuba divers. So they'll scuba dive under the ice in winter, and when the ice melts in the summer, they'll scuba dive from a small boat. But they'll be working on local collections or monitoring local seafloor creatures in the shallow water all year round. So it really depends what questions we're trying to answer on how often we go there and what we do.
We have a question. Do you plan on returning to the Sponge Rock to try and grab a sample or more footage?
So that's a really good question. And actually, we're limited by technology on that one. So firstly, it's very expensive and difficult to go there and drill a hole anyway. But at least we know where that rock is. And hopefully the rock is staying put, because that rocks are pretty good at that. But we also are limited by how we can collect things. So what they did was just had a video camera attached to something. We want to put something down where we can study this closer and maybe collect a small tissue sample or something like that without destroying the habitat, because obviously this is something new and we're not sure how common it is. So we don't want to just go in there and rip up the whole rock and bring it back, because that would be destructive and pointless. So we can do that if we have the technology to do it. You have two choices. You either drill another hole and put something down the hole, but all the current ROVs and things are too big to go down that kind of hole. So we'd have to invent a small one that can cope with the cold temperatures. Or we create something so clever that you send it in from the other end of the ice and it goes off on its own and collects you a sample on its own under the ice, because you can't communicate with something via radio or whatever once it's under that 900 meters of ice. So technology will solve it, and it's going to be the same technology that helps us look at places like Europa or whatever to see if there's life under those frozen moons and things. So that will be exciting, but it does mean that the tools I use at the moment and the tools those geologists were using are not the ones that will help us with this. But we could, if we had another hole, collect some water and sediment samples for what's called environmental DNA. So that's where you run the whole water sample and the whole mud sample to see what any DNA is in it. And we may not be lucky enough to get the sponge DNA, for example, but we might get what they're eating. So the dead and decaying bits of food that are coming in might collect in the water or the mud, and we can find out some answers from that as well. So there's lots of technology we can use, but it's not like old school stuff where I could put a fishing net down or an ROV or something anywhere else in the world and just pretty much get to what I need to.
So we have another question. How old do you believe the organisms are, like the sponges, that you have discovered?
honest answer is I have no clue. I know that they've grown, so we have different sizes. So some of them must be older than others or getting better food than others. But until we actually get hold of them and can do some carbon dating and things like that, then I really have no idea. And that's what's exciting about these. These could be 5 years old, or they could be 500 years old, and I have no idea. And that kind of is frustrating, but at the same time amazing.
Yeah. Sorry, I just. Is there an ongoing hydrocarbon study in Antarctica?
So, in terms of commercial exploitation, that's not allowed under the Antarctic Treaty. So there's no kind of oil or gas exploitation. But we do study things like hydrothermal vents from underwater volcanoes. We have the methane seeps, for example. They're studied whenever we find one. But obviously, because they're quite difficult to work out where they are, it's a rare thing when we find them, and they're quite amazing. They're not high in biodiversity, but they're often high in numbers of animals that are specialist ones that have special bacteria that can convert these hydrocarbons into food for them. So, and then we sort of have the blue carbon question of Antarctica locking away a lot of carbon into its sediment, which eventually becomes some of these hydrocarbons and things. So there's a lot of scientific interest, but not commercial interest in those kind of things in Antarctica.
Okay. Another question is, how do your equipments work at so low temperatures?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I've seen small ROVs lowered into the water that have died within 10 minutes because they go from cold temperatures outside to -2 degrees in the water. And then any fresh water or condensation that's built up on the thing then just damages the equipment. So you really have to go to the right engineers, essentially, who are experienced in either waterproofing the right parts of the system or actually sort of putting in as much padding and things to protect your equipment as possible, but also how you treat it before you put it in and out of the water. But batteries and things die a lot quicker, so you're much better off with something that's on a powered cable, for example, where you can power it from the ship, than you are with something with battery powers, because battery can die quite quickly. But having said that, things like gliders, ocean gliders that can go off on their own, some of them can be left for 3 or 4 months on their own with their own battery power and things. So they're developing new technology for those sorts of things as well. It works better.
Okay. And what kind of difficulties do you face during your research in these environments?
So it's amazing, actually, working in polar regions, you have all the normal things, like your equipment can fail, your ship can break, all of those kind of things. And then you throw in the ice and the cold and the storms and everything else. So the Southern Ocean is one of the roughest, windiest places in the world. So if that picks up as a storm, then that can stop your work completely. You also have the issue of sea ice. So some vessels can't work in thick sea ice. And we've had multiple missions that have been thwarted by sea ice just being too thick to go any further. I sat in a German vessel for 3 weeks, not going anywhere, stuck in the ice at one point because we'd gone as far as we could. And that's quite an amazing feeling to think, oh, now we know what Shackleton and his men felt like, but we're in a much safer ship. But you're essentially going, okay, the sea ice is surrounding us. We don't have any choices in this. And also when you're working on deck, anyone who's ever done anything in temperate climates where it's 14 degrees and wet and miserable and cold, you want to go in and have a warm cup of tea and warm up a bit. Well, in Antarctica, it's like -20 sometimes when you're working on deck. So the seawater in your net is freezing up and everything is freezing up. So then you have to be really careful you don't get any cold yourself, but also sometimes you wrap up so warm that when you start doing physical work, you start to overheat because you've got so many layers on. So there's a kind of balancing act and also looking after each other to make sure that nobody's working too hard in the cold and making themselves, chances of getting hypothermia or anything like that. So you've got to really, although working on ships is always dangerous, you've got to take extra care when there's ice around and snow around, because you could easily miss something like that you would trip over, or you might slip on the ice. And also, if you fall overboard, in most places, you have maybe half an hour for them to come back and find you before you've got hypothermia. chances are in Antarctica, within 5 or 10 minutes, if you're not wearing the right clothing, you'd be dead from the cold anyway. So we have to be very, very strict on all the safety on the ship as well.
Okay. How does climate change affect the growth and spread of phytoplankton and krill? You mentioned are very abundant.
So the interesting thing is a lot of people think the cold is restrictive, but actually krill like the cold, and these phytoplankton blooms are generally in the colder water. So when we've had years of warm anomalies now, so not necessarily climate change, but weather patterns and things that have put warm water further south than it should be, then those have been very bad years for penguin chicks and things, for example, because there's less krill near the islands that are further north. So climate change definitely negatively impacts krill, but also they have a nursery ground for their young under the sea ice. So if you melt the sea ice, you're also losing a huge habitat for krill young to grow up in where they're safe from predators. So again, krill numbers can be very badly impacted by climate change.
Okay, we have another question. Were you able to identify any of the species in the rock from the footage only, or are they too cryptic?
I personally am not confident identifying anything to species, because I think some of them could well be new species, for example, because they're living in such a harsh and strange environment. But also, even down to genus or family level, they look like, at least two of the two sponges look like you could maybe get them to genus or family. But even having approached sponge experts, they weren't certain. And then I've had sort of lots of people email me since the press release for that story came out saying, oh, it's definitely this, or I can only see one species of thing there. And so everyone's got an opinion on a video. And that's why I'm reluctant to give out names for things, because I think if you want to be wrong, the easiest thing to do is give out an opinion on a video, because until you can see the real thing, you can never confirm or deny it. So I think it's safer just to say we think they're sponges and we think they're filter feeding sponges. And from that point onwards, it's a great discovery for whoever gets to actually name them and do it properly. But I don't want to give my best guess at this point, because there's some animals on that rock that I wouldn't even know what they were at all. So, you know, I've got to be realistic.
Okay, and I think the final question we have is, should we encourage the global community to explore Antarctica rather than exploring Moon or Mars?
I honestly think the global community is already exploring Antarctica. So we have the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, which coordinates lots of Antarctic research. And we have some amazing Antarctic researchers who, luckily, Antarctica is devoted to peace and science. It's not a commercial place. So there's no commercial gain from working in Antarctica, which means that if I want to work with a colleague from Australia or India or Malaysia or Norway, there's no secrecy and competition in that way. So this last paper, there were Australians, New Zealanders and Americans on that paper because they had drilled other holes that we compared data to. So that's a great thing about Antarctica. And plus the technology that people are developing to work in space might be what we need to help us in Antarctica anyway. So I think people working in space is also an amazing and fascinating thing, and we can learn from them at the same time. So as long as it's not a either or question, I think we should do both. I think it's really difficult if we restricted science funding to the point where you had to choose between the two, because both of them have lots of things that humans can learn from. And I also think it's really important that this is where we live, and we need to understand it without trashing it as well. So I don't want to study Antarctica by messing it up. I also want to do it responsibly. So even now we're moving away from catching lots of animals in nets to selectively collecting with ROVs and things and using video to do the counts and things rather than killing lots of things. If you pull something up from 500 meters down, not many of those things would survive to go back in the sea. So our compromise is to use small nets and to then study everything that we catch and bring everything back and don't throw anything overboard, so that it all goes to museums and experts. And that's how we find so many of these new species.
I think that's all the questions we have so far.
And they're good questions as well, really good questions. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, no, thank you for the wonderful answers to the questions as well. So they,
it's my pleasure. Yeah, so unless anybody's got any more questions, I just want to thank you all for coming, really, because it's been nice to talk to people who are interested in the seabed as well, because very often everybody loves krill and whales and seals, but our bit gets forgotten. So thank you.
Yeah. I'll just sorry, this. If anybody, I think we've had. If anybody would like to say thank you to.
Well, there's lots of thank you. There's lots of thank yous popping up in the chat. Thank you for that, everybody.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks for arranging such a beautiful session, and thanks for fascinating talk as well.
Thank you.
And just in terms of like conservation, do you think it's protected enough, or is it?
It's difficult to say because you can't protect against the biggest threat, which is climate change. So fishing and things is very well regulated. And although we get told we need more marine protected areas, there have been recent studies from other areas, not Antarctica, that have shown that actually it's very difficult to mitigate against climate change by stopping fishing, because they're two separate problems. One may make the other one worse slightly, but in reality, if the water changes temperature, no amount of stopping fishing will stop the animals that can't cope with those temperatures from disappearing. So I think the big message that has to come out of Antarctica is that we're affecting it even if we're not fishing there. There are parts of Antarctica where there's been no fishing for decades, but they're still changing climate and still changing temperature. So I'm sat in Cambridge in the UK, but things I do are melting the Antarctic. So, and even more than that, things that my government does and other governments around the world allow to happen are making that worse on a much bigger scale than us as individuals. So it is about pushing for taking these issues seriously is more important, I think. So conservation is good in Antarctica now. If you compare it to the days of whaling and overfishing and things, it was terrible in the past. But now the whales are recovering, the fish stocks are slowly recovering, seals and penguins are doing quite well in most areas. But if the sea ice melts, there's a lot of species that will suffer from that, for example, and that won't be because of fishing.
Okay, so I think that's a useful note to conclude the seminar. So I'd just like to thank you so much for really informing us of the this undiscovered this of the whole range of species and also for like if anybody is interested, the studies published in the Frontiers of Marine Science.
Yes, yeah. And it should be somewhere near the top of the most viewed now because it's gone crazy. It's like I think like 80 or 90,000 people have looked at the paper or something. So it's easy to find on the journal front page is the useful thing of that. But, yeah, and it's free to download. It's open access if anybody wants to see the most recent paper. Otherwise, I'm on Twitter and things like that if you wanted to follow and find out more, but there's also all sorts of other nonsense on there as well, the seafloor stuff. But try to put a bit of Antarctic stuff in there every week as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Huw, and I hope you can join us for future sessions.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me as well. It was a real pleasure.
Okay. Okay, thank you everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks. Yes.
Bye.
Yep.